Well, we're back
We are.
for another episode.
Yeah. Our yearly episode.
What is it? A series of unfortunate events with the Patrick.
That sounds like a good TV show.
I used to love that book series.
Dopamine Snickets.
Yeah,
I watched the movies with Jim Carrey, but I don't think I ever saw anything
they
else.
weren't nearly as good as the books.
No, I watched the one with Neil Patrick Harris. That one was okay. I mean, he did a great job, but
I didn't see that one.
I had a hard time getting into it.
Oh, that's
So,
the reality of our life right now.
yeah. So, what's going on with the Patricks?
I mean, well, I just had a horrific life-changing event last year, and then it looks like you're kind of stepping into one
Now-
yourself.
Now it's my turn?
Now it's your turn.
Okay.
Time to level up.
Yeah. I'm glad we get to go through this.
Wow. I would say I wouldn't want to go through it with anybody else.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So what, about 2 months ago?
In June.
Yeah. So I was picking up Athena and turning at the same time, and my back just went out. And went for a walk and thinking, okay, like, this has happened before in the past, and I just need to walk it off and get it to loosen up. And usually within a couple days, I can get it to relax, and it was not happening. Significantly worse than it's been, I'd say, in the probably past decade.
Well, give some background on where all this originated from and how you've been basically coping with chronic back pain since.
So I was working construction in my early 20s, and we were waiting for a forklift to come lift a bunch of iron, and everybody was hollering and screaming and getting impatient, and I was super strong at the time, and so I just went and picked up the iron and started moving it. And then the next morning when I woke up, I couldn't move. Like, literally, I thought I was paralyzed. I couldn't get out of bed. And so, like, I flopped myself onto the ground and, like, crawled to the bathroom because it's kind of my routine. And I couldn't sit down. I couldn't, function. I was really, really afraid that, like, I had paralyzed myself. So then many doctor's visits and that kind of stuff later, they just said that I had compressed the disc, that I probably had some type of herniation or something, and there's really nothing they could do about it, that I was too young for surgery, and kind of that was it. I just had to deal with it. So PT, and then, in the first probably 3 or 4 years, periodically it would go out and it would just floor me. I mean, walking with a cane, walking like an old man, walking with a walker. I finally got an inversion table, and that helped, like, being able to stretch it out. And then being active definitely helped. I got into martial arts again and started training more, but then it was like every once in a while it would just go out, and it'd take me a while to get it back in place. That and then, I popped my knee out of place when I was 23, 24. And so kind of alternating between my knee popping out and my back going out, I was kind of a physical mess for a lot of years. And then, what did the x-rays say? What was the date on the car accident when I was in Massachusetts? 14?
I think so.
2014, I had a car accident, and my knee popped out, and then I hurt my back. And then I tore a labrum in my left shoulder. And so then a bunch of rehab. They ended up fixing my knee, which was great, because then I didn't have to duct tape my knee anymore to train. That has been great, knock on wood, since. The back has just always been there, and the last probably, I don't know, 5, 6 years, it's been better than it has been. Every once in a while I'd get a twinge in it, but nothing like it was. I've done a lot of things on it, and so yeah. we finally got in to see an orthopedic surgeon last week, and uh, he asked, you know, did you know you had a fracture in your back? And I thought maybe he was looking at the wrong slides or wrong information. He said, no. He said, we can see in this x-ray from 2014 that there's a fracture there, and asked me if any of the doctors ever asked me about it. And then he showed us where that piece was broken off, and
And he's compared it to a normal back too, and it's like pretty obvious.
yeah, yeah. And then, talked about the degenerative stuff that's going on. So, I mean, I guess I had known that for a while because I was originally 6'4", and now I'm 5'7".
Series of unfortunate events.
So I'd lost, what is that, 8 inches in my mind. But yeah, and so
I just mention what the solution to that was.
so the doctor recommended a double spinal fusion, and then talked about going through the abdomen, and then what it would be going through the back. And he didn't sugarcoat anything, which I kind of appreciated. And he just talked about how bad the recovery is, and potential side effects, right? That sometimes it doesn't fix pain. Sterilization. We've been talking about, having another baby once you're cleared and then officially in remission from cancer. And so, yeah, I mean, that was obviously a big knock. What else came up?
Just how
Blood clots.
well, as soon as you get one,
Oh, okay, yeah.
because of how the pressure gets loaded onto the disc above where the fusion is, you're essentially signing yourself up to continuously have to do fusions.
Yeah.
And, it could be within a few years, but very likely within 10 to 12 years,
Yeah.
you'd have to do another one.
Yeah, he said his mom was on her 5th.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah. So we went home and sat on it for the weekend and started thinking about, what we were going to do. And so I just kind of did what I always do and tried to be resourceful and looked at YouTube University of different people's, experiences with fusions, and wasn't finding a lot of good stuff. And so then I reached out to a friend of mine that sells medical supplies, and he connected us with a couple other surgeons. And so we had those conversations on Monday. One of them, we talked to the guy for a pretty good while. And he recommended trying to delay the fusion as long as possible.
Yeah, I said basically if there's like numbness or, weakness in the legs and in the muscles, that's a problem because those nerves are being pinched and that could cause permanent damage. But if it's just pain, basically do everything you can to tolerate the pain or manage the pain, mitigate the pain for as long as you can.
Yeah. Yeah. And so he gave some recommendations in regards to strengthen the core as much as possible. Lose the dad bod. That was disappointing to hear.
Why?
Because I've rocked the dad bod for so long. It's become part of my identity. I'm known as the fat athlete. I went to that men's group and told them that I had ran a marathon last September, and the guy kind of looked at me and he was like, "You don't really look like a runner." And I was like, "Well, that's the reason why I did it."
You're like, that's my appeal.
Yeah, I mean that's what got me where I'm at, is I can sneak up on people and they don't recognize it.
It is your entire career is basically based off of that.
Yeah, people underestimating me.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, after that conversation, I felt like the fusion became an absolute last resort. I felt like I've got to do everything I can to try to manage this thing and avoid it. And so, yeah, now, applying all the tools and skills that I've developed over the years is, you know, long-term goals is obviously drop body weight and strengthen the core as much as possible. Changing the way that I'm exercising, you know, um, high repetition, low weight. I've been able to do some more. I'm probably, do I say this right? Plyometrics,
Hmm.
like using my body weight for working out. So I can do push-ups now. I can do squats now. Assisted chin-ups, like with a band. And so, yeah, now I just have some different physical goals. So I think for right now, I'm going to have to retire from Spartan races and marathons and whatnot. Um, I'll have to look in to see if there's walking races.
There are
Are there really?
speed walking.
Speed walking.
It's an Olympic game.
What?
Yeah.
I'm headed to the Olympics?
I didn't say that, but
I I think I can make it
I,
with the break dancing. I can go for the Australian team and do break dancing.
yeah.
Yeah. No, my back, I don't know how well it would handle. It would be some serious break dancing with my back. Um,
Yeah, they call it breaking.
yeah,
You would be
I
breaking,
would
all
be
right.
breaking for sure. You'd see anguish. I could flop around on the ground like she did, that's for sure. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in general it's worth highlighting. Like, I remember we came out of that, meeting, and it was very heavy.
hmm
Just being told that it was basically worse than we thought, and the solution is worse than we thought. And then the doctor was like, "But it's not hopeless. It's there's still hope." And I was like, "Really?"
yeah,
I mean, it was hard in that moment, but as we got out, I asked you how you were feeling, and you were like, "Well, I mean, it's just what we're gonna have to deal with.
it is what it
It
is.
is what it is." And I think that there's getting to that place isn't as easy as you talking conveys. Like, you're just talking about like, yeah, so then I started to be resourceful and do this and do that and do that. And I don't think that like I think most people, including myself, like had those moments, like especially in the beginning, that whole evening was, a little unsettling in many ways. And it wasn't like I ever felt like, oh, I don't know what we're going to do. But it's like, man, this is, a bummer and a challenge. And like, why did we go through last year's challenge and then now, we have this on our plate? Like, for me, my mind spirals more into a lot of those existential style questions of like,
Yeah,
what's the purpose of this? Like, why are we having to deal with this?
and I think I was able to get to those places when I was immobile and I couldn't move because I did start to think about it. Um, like as long as I didn't move, I wasn't in pain. All right, so like I couldn't walk really. Couldn't stand very well. And it was just like, how did I go from training to being in this place where like I literally I don't know that I can function,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I can't sit on a toilet. I remember that was the reality. I was thinking like, do I have to go outside and go to the bathroom in the yard because I can't sit without just excruciating pain. And so then, I started trying to think about all the stuff that like I share with people, and the thing that started resonating with me is what is this trying to teach me? Right? Like you easily go into that when you're in a lot of pain, right? Like why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? This is suffering, and you start trying to I guess resolve that in some way. And for me, I started thinking about, okay, so what is this trying to teach me? And it was like I've mastered, like, maybe mastered's a strong word, but mastered being active and not being complacent with being still, right? I heard this thing, and I think it was in a movie that we watched a couple years ago that said all of man's problems come from his inability to sit in a room and do nothing. And that's always really resonated with me because I don't really like to be still very often.
Yeah.
I think it's part of my right? It's part of my ADHD.
Mhm.
You know, I don't have the hyperactive part, but I've definitely got the attention deficit.
Mhm.
And so, um, as we're talking about that, I recognize there were some partridges over there. But um, you know, recognizing or knowing how I function and that kind of stuff, I started thinking about that as like all the races, the MMA fights, all that kind of stuff. Like I do well with that part. I do well with being really active. The being at peace and without the physical activity is the challenge for me. And so I also know that's what led me to addiction, substance abuse, and that kind of
Mm.
stuff. And so um, dealing with this, it started like, okay, so how am I going to be able to manage these feelings and emotions without movement, right? And so, yeah, that was the thing that was coming up for me.
Mhm.
Um,
You foresee that being your big lesson in this?
yeah, I think so. Um, and then recognizing there's things that like I had ignored doing and I kept procrastinating on and putting off. Writing a book. I I've had a couple different versions that I've tried and you know always keep putting it off because it seems like such a daunting task that it's like I'm definitely not going to write it about procrastination because
That's one you haven't mastered yet.
yeah, I would not get that one done. It's always like I'm going to write that chapter. Well, I'll start tomorrow. Um, but no, the book idea has always been about how do people make changes in their lives, right? And for myself, same thing, right? Because I wasn't always a therapist, right? I mean, you know, when I reflect back on the life that I used to live, right, it was at one point I didn't feel like it was worth living. So to go from that to where I'm at now, that I do appreciate life and I do love things and I love myself, you know, it's a pretty big change. And so, um, you know, the other thing that kept coming up for me is thinking about I don't know why I started thinking about life as like a river, right? Like it just keeps going. You can't stop it, right? And you know, I remember one of the first times I got in rough waters with a friend of mine. Um, we were canoeing, and I was fishing. They're not a fisherman, and I was fishing. And then they said, "Well, can you strap down your fishing pole?" I said, "Yeah." So I strap it down. And he said, "Well, can you strap down your tackle box?" I said, "Yeah." And he was like, "Okay." And I was like, "Why are you asking me all these questions?" He's like, "Well, the water's a lot rougher than I thought it was." And they've got a good amount of swift water experience. So when they said that, I got a little nervous, and I said, "Okay." I said, "Well, if we get thrown out of the canoe, hold on to the paddle, don't let it go. Like that's really important." So I said, "Oh, all right." So then we start heading up, and he says, "Well, if the canoe comes up, don't grab a hold of the side. Like dig in, you know, because I was in the front. He was like, dig in, and we just got to paddle our way through it." I was like, "Okay." And so we hit the first part. The canoe came up. I grabbed the side. We topple over, right? I grab a hold of the oar, and I just like see water and things just all around me, and I'm freaking out. I'm like, okay, well this is how I go. And I float up, and I'm holding the oar, and I'm kind of bobbing up and down, and I look over, and he's literally like feet downriver like this, and he's holding onto the oar, and he's looking at me, and I can see him because I'm kind of right next to him and he's just totally chilled. And I was like, well, if he's not afraid, maybe I don't need to be afraid. And so I just kind of like flipped on my back, you know, and got my feet going downriver and just kind of rode it out. And we got to the end of it, and I was like, that was pretty cool,
Hmm.
right? Because I made it through it. And so, you know, obviously there's lots of life lessons in those experiences like that. Um,
Symbolic of a lot of things too.
yeah,
I think like, I mean, I know we were maybe going to get into the discussion of relationships also, but I feel like not only does it speak on maintaining some sense of peace as you go through struggle because it's going to pass, but also, I mean, the impact of who's around you.
yeah,
I mean, how significant is that?
yeah, yeah. That makes sense. I did have a good working relationship with them, and I had a lot of trust. And so when I saw that they weren't afraid or freaking out, it felt like there wasn't any need for me to do that.
Well, I felt that with you too when I asked you, you know, how are you feeling about all of this? And you were calm and, you know, well, we'll just deal with it. You know, it definitely brought relief to me.
Yeah,
I mean, I felt that going through treatment last year, you know, it was like, I mean, part of it was like, you know, you just have to deal with it, right? There's no other option
yeah,
kind of thing. But having the support around me of people who were encouraging and, you know, specifically you, voicing that calmness and that peace and, you know, not compiling onto the worries and the concern, that was very soothing.
yeah. Well, I knew it wasn't needed during that time also. You know, like it wasn't a time that was about me. You know, and I felt like, you know, yeah, I knew it definitely wouldn't help. Um,
Well, and I think like a lot of people that when even they witness people close to them deal with those types of challenges, it pulls up their own fears, perhaps around their own mortality, but
sure.
also around this vulnerable, you know, emotional dependency that you have on this other person
Yeah,
who's being threatened,
yeah,
right? So I think that when people take on, I don't know, that persona of worry and concern in a way that compiles onto a situation negatively, I think a lot of it, I would assume, is probably based on their own internal fears and processing what's coming up in them around it, right?
yeah,
And that's, you see that very often in big life events. When babies are born, when people die, things like that, you know, you see people's like true colors kind of come out.
sure. Yeah. I mean, but you also see some people that grow from it. You know, I wish I had my book in front of me. That there was something that I learned about recently. Post traumatic growth. That's what it was. Right. That they were talking about. I might get it wrong, but they were talking about like athletes that had severe um, injuries. That when they started thinking about, you know, if my career's over, can I potentially help other people? That these people had what they called a post-traumatic growth, and that some of them actually made a comeback and became actually better athletes from it.
Mm,
You know, and I think it resonates once again with that. What is this trying to teach me versus why is this happening to me?
right.
Right? If you look for the lesson in it, you're gonna find it. Right? If you choose to stay in suffering, you're gonna remain in suffering.
Yeah.
And so, learning about that, you know, was a big one because I think all the big stuff that we have gone through, right? I mean, it's grown us in ways, you know, like, yeah. I mean, I think we both have done our research and decided to make changes in our individual lives and then also together.
Yeah. Big time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's kind of I think to me that's like the mark of a healthy relationship is, can you grow together?
Sure.
And that's not easy to do. That's pretty challenging to do.
Well, and there's also the part you can't grow together if you can't accept each other's influence,
Mm,
right? Like, that's one thing about, I guess, Gottman method that I really like. They have what's called the sound relationship house, right? And part of the foundation of that house is accepting your partner's influence, right? And so if there's not trust there, right, you're not going to accept the the other person's influence in any way, right? And how much disconnection happens because of that. I don't trust you because of X, Y, and Z, right? I mean, I think that that's something that you and I have really worked on is being able to trust each other,
yeah.
right? Because, we both have past relationships and things where trust wasn't there, right? And so we had to establish what trust looked like between us,
Mm,
you know, and yeah, having the similar values and what we want out of the relationship. You know, we've grown to learn that the goal is connection within the relationship, right? And to not feed into disconnection, which I know in the past, it's been an issue for me, right? Because it's like I'm upset, right? I want you to feel what it is that I'm feeling,
mm-hmm.
right? And you know, our relationship healed me in such a way that I feel like we are able to have the relationship that we do because of that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a big contributor for sure. And I mean, it's also like leaving out communication tendencies and sensitivities.
Mm.
It's such a balance when you're feeling, so much and emotions are heightened and you're trying to communicate, and then at the same time you have to be so attentive to how what you're saying is landing with the other person.
Yeah.
And it's challenging because a lot of the time there's this narrative of, well, I'm just speaking the truth. This is something that I've personally been on a journey with, is
Mm.
like, how do you speak the truth, with love and in a way that fosters a relational connection?
Yeah.
And sometimes truth can be weaponized, and that's been like a big lesson for me in my life personally. But it's challenging when you're in a place where it's like, well, it's true, and that is the truth, and the other person is hurt by what you've said, and you've now created an environment of like defensiveness or being closed off.
Well, so like, yes, the truth is the truth, right? But like, how do we bring people to a place to where they can hear the truth,
Yep.
right? And I think it's through trust and a healthy relationship, right? I mean, what is it, like 90% of the what is it 90% of the
Talk about the therapeutic
yeah.
relationship. Yeah, like something like 90% of the success in
Yes.
therapy is based off of the therapeutic relationship between the client and the counselor.
90%, right? Like that means that the interventions, right, are 10% of it,
Yeah.
right? If I'm doing my math right.
Yeah, I need to look up that study again. That was
Yeah.
from my term I took last year.
But I remember learning that in grad school, and it hasn't changed from what I understand. Um, and so for me, that has always resonated with the approach that I take when it comes to counseling. Like when I worked at the therapeutic boarding school, um, building the relationships with people is when I saw the changes starting to happen. Because they trusted me,
Yeah.
and they would accept my influence, right? If they didn't, right, then it was met with a lot of resistance in those ways. And you see it in all relationships. So, yeah, I think it definitely goes back to that.
Well, and I see that is all based on communication.
Hmm.
That, all of trust, security, and being vulnerable, all of that is based on how you communicate, what's
Sure.
communicated. I think communication skills are highly underrated at
Yeah.
this point in time.
Well, and it starts, I think, with you can't communicate if you can't emotionally regulate.
Yeah.
You know, that's something that has come up. As we start, as I started with the couples training, was you can't do any of this if people can't emotionally regulate,
Right.
because there can't be emotional safety if somebody's being reactive, right? I can't say, well, come, I want you to come talk to me, right? If something comes up and then you come talk to me and I'm like, what are you talking about? I don't
Right.
do that. This is in your mind or whatever it is, right? You're not going to come talk to me again.
Right.
So, being able to regulate and accept each other's influence and not be defensive about it and recognize like people have different perceptions of things.
Well, and this is, as you were talking, I feel like that is probably one of the hardest things to reconcile in relationships is when someone else has a different truth
Yeah.
than you do, right? Because sorry, oh no, because that's very difficult, I think, in many levels. But number one, people don't know how to communicate super well, nor do they feel a willingness to sit in that discomfort and challenge of facing someone who has a different truth than you.
Yeah.
I mean, it can pull up a lot of things. If you're not confident in your own perspective, a lot of times people start doubting, their own belief system. And when our identity is connected to that, it's very jarring,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where it's like, okay, I'm done with this, and you start to see those disconnective and avoidance tendencies instead of a willingness to accept that there are other people with different truths.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's that skill that it's lacking so much, and it's at the basis of a lot of disconnection you see in the world. A lot of resistance to finding solutions to
Yeah.
things, right? People are too wrapped up in, we don't see eye to eye on this, so we're going to get nowhere. And this lack of compromise, and so therefore, you kind of see this stalemate. I mean, you see this directly in politics in a very obvious way, but I think in relationships it's very common as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to get along with people who agree with you. It's easy to get along with people who validate the things that you think.
Sure.
It's challenging when someone challenges you or questions your judgment,
Yeah.
right? Or questions your discernment. And I think that I mean, that's something I've witnessed in our relationship, is like just recognizing, you know, you do have my best interest in mind,
Yeah.
and you're not challenging me to put me down, you're challenging me because there's more to the picture that you're trying to curate, sight on kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's I mean, that, like you're saying, like trust is the basis of it all, right? If you don't trust another person, there's no way you can get to that point of thinking, okay, this person wants my best interest in mind. And anybody who has trust issues is by default not going to have that,
Yeah.
right? And so I think that that's where you get a lot of challenges in relationships is that they'll click, and I would imagine in marriages too, very quickly click into that storytelling of why that person has malicious intent
Mm-hmm.
potentially, right? Or this person's just asking me that because they're trying to manipulate me,
Yeah.
right? Or this person has some vendetta against me and they're trying to control me, and
Mm-hmm.
that's why they're coming at me like that.
Yeah. And unfortunately, in some relationships, that's true. All right.
Yes.
I mean, and I think this is the important part of discernment, right? And understanding the whole story with things. Like it's what I've really enjoyed about doing couples counseling is because individually you hear one side,
Yeah.
right, and then in couples you get to hear both sides of it. You can kind of see things from two different perspectives, and try to understand where disconnection happens because of that.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately, like, we're not, if it's not modeled for us what healthy relationships look like, we kind of stumble around on our own trying to figure it out. And if we don't know or have these tools, right, then we just kind of create our own, right? And if we're in the belief that I'm supposed to be happy in the relationship all the time, right? And all my needs are supposed to be met, and if they're not, then, like, there's many fish in the sea type thing,
Right.
right? It's easy to feed into disconnection because the grass is always going to be greener on the other side.
Right.
That's I was reading a book a while back that was talking, well, it was about sex addiction, and it was talking about very commonly affairs and that kind of stuff start to happen because of fantasies. People fantasize about, you know, a better situation than what they are in. And then at some point, something comes up that presents the opportunity, but that most affairs start as friendships,
Mm.
right? So they start confining in this individual outside of the relationship, right? So, like, I can't trust my partner, I can't tell them these
Mm.
things, right? So I have this friend, right, that I'm able to do that with. And then at some point, right, that relationship starts to develop, and they start, fantasizing. Well, my life would be so much better with Susie, right? Because Susie meets my needs, and she's vulnerable, and like, her poop doesn't smell, and all that kind of stuff, right? The reality of things doesn't set in, and so you start seeing the grass is greener on the other side. Um, it was interesting that I was actually doing some studying yesterday, and it said 90% of relationships that develop off of an affair end up not working. And the primary reason they don't work is because they can't trust the other person.
Hmm. Makes sense.
Well, that's weird.
Yeah.
We had an affair, and then we decided to leave our partners, and then now we don't trust each other.
Yeah.
Hmm. Doesn't How does that make sense?
Yeah.
So,
Well, and I think you're speaking on also this difference in mindset of like trying to move through a challenge
mhm.
versus get out of a challenge.
Yeah,
I think there's also, just like thought around this problem is based off of this other person
yeah,
versus what's my part
yeah,
in this problem. It's very easy if you're like, I don't want to deal with this. This person is messed up. They're the one with the issue, and as soon as they're gone, I'm not going to have this problem.
yeah.
If you can shift that blame and kind of deflect that accountability, it gets easier to move into that mental space of just justifying
Mhm.
that type of choice.
It's accountability,
Hmm.
right? Like, you know, I think that was a really useful tool for our relationship, is that if we do have conflict, when we separate, that you're thinking about what potentially is going on for the other person
Hmm.
versus, like, being mad and fuming and then, like, creating a court case so that when you come together you can argue your point even
Right.
better, right? Which is what I would do, right? If we separated, I was like, ooh, I got all these things that I just can't wait to come back and just unload on, right? But it wasn't helpful. Just fed more disconnection, led to another timeout, and then we just kind of repeated that cycle until we got exhausted and just didn't talk about it anymore.
Right.
But trying to think about what potentially was upsetting you, right, put me into empathy, right, and I started trying to, like, problem solve, try to figure out what was going on for us, right, versus myself.
Yeah. Well, and I think like also like we're kind of getting into this discussion of boundaries in a way because you have relationships that are unhealthy
Yeah.
and unbalanced. You do have people that are manipulative,
Hmm.
right? And have malicious intent. You also have people that, are either enablers or passive,
Yeah.
and so continue to experience that boundary pushing,
Yep.
or be, victims of someone not respecting their boundary. And so it's like, well, how do you manage that becomes something worth reflecting on a lot more. I think about our relationship, and it's like anytime there's been something come up where it's like, hey, I need more of this or less of this, as we recognize it doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
And, I can't move into a place of like, oh, he's just disrespecting my boundary. We just had a conversation about this yesterday,
Yeah.
and he's still leaving his stuff all around or whatever. There has to be some understanding and grace in that process of like, okay, let's see if he's actually going to try, or is he just, did my words just totally go through one ear and out the other,
Yeah.
right? It's like there has to be some patience in that, and a willingness to kind of watch it evolve. And then, I mean, there's been things in our relationship that have come up multiple times,
Hmm.
and it's not that it fell on deaf ears, I don't feel, at least. It's just that, like, okay, our attention's been divided in so many other areas. Like, how do we proactively work on this more?
Well, and I think how do you broach those things where it doesn't come off as like an attack, right? How do you say, hey, like, can you put your shoes on the shoe rack without it coming off like, how many times have I told you to do this,
Right.
right? And trying to use shame as an influence to change somebody's behavior, right? And I think that, yeah, it's important to be able to recognize, and I haven't done the research. I just kind of always accepted this because my martial arts teacher told me this, that it was like 2,000 repetitions for something to become muscle memory, right? 90 days for something to become a habit, right? So how many times do you have to do something before you see changes start to take place? So, if we set an expectation and it's not met right away, right? It's how do we influence changes, right? And
Support them
sure,
rather than, diminish motivation,
yeah,
right? Because you want to encourage, you want someone to feel a motivation to step into that change versus defeat for
yeah,
not doing the change.
yeah, absolutely,
And I think you see this in so many things, like absolutely in personal relationships, but I mean, that's probably one of the biggest gripes in the past that I've had with Christianity.
mm,
Is that there's this shame and judgment association with certain things that were communicated to me in the past, and
yeah,
in no way was it encouraging a connection to God, or inspiring any sense of hope.
yeah,
It was like, oh, I'm gonna stay away from that. That makes me feel terrible.
yeah, yeah. Why would you resonate with something that makes you feel bad about yourself?
Yeah.
Right, it's easy to reject that and try to move yourself further away from it. I mean, it's just natural defense mechanism.
It's interesting to see this too with people who, well, expect help and don't get it, right? They want others to help and support them. They want to feel that nourishment, um, but they might not ask for it,
Hmm.
or if someone doesn't just voluntarily step up and do it,
Yeah, mind reading.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's this like, oh, well, clearly I'm not worthy and this person doesn't love me like I thought. Like you're saying, get into these cognitive distortions.
yeah.
Yeah, so the cognitive distortions, I
Well,
think, can drive things. Why don't you
yeah.
speak on some of that?
Well, I mean, like the mind reading, right? Like, you hurt your own feelings because you have an idea of the way something should be, right? But you didn't lay out clear expectations of it, right? And I hear this a lot from people that I work with, right? That well, they should have known, right? Like it was my birthday, they should have known, that I wanted to go to hot springs, right? And it's like, well, did you communicate that? Well, no. I said it last year. I said last year I wanted to go to Hot Springs, and it's like, oh, okay. And a lot has happened in between then, right? And so,
Well, and that ties into like personalization,
hmm
right? That, oh, that person is clearly mad at me because they didn't
well,
say something or do something.
and that's come up a lot with me because I have a stoic face, and so because I don't have a lot of facial expression at times, that people have a hard time reading me,
Yeah.
right? That came up a lot in the beginning of our
Yep.
relationship is that, I would get done working and I'd be in my head thinking about stuff, and I could see you kind of like,
Are you mad at me?
yeah,
Yeah.
like kind of what's going on,
Yeah.
right? Like, are you upset, or yeah, are you mad at me? And it was like, no, I just got done working. This is my thinking face type thing, right? But without knowing, right, it's easy to make that assumption, right, that potentially there's something going on, right? And I think it goes back to the value of asking questions and communicating. Don't make assumptions, right? What is it they say about assumptions?
You make a,
Ass out of you and me.
yeah.
Yeah. And so,
Yeah,
yeah,
that goes into the assumptions also tying into like shoulda, coulda, wouldas.
yeah,
The You just have to get rid of shoulda, coulda, wouldas.
yeah,
You either do something or you do not, and you have to just have clarity in that
yeah.
instead of letting your mind spin about what you should have done, could have done, what you would do,
Yeah.
things like that.
Well, the great philosopher Yoda said, do or do not. There is no try,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and that obviously resonates with a lot of Star Wars dorks. So I'm a Star Wars dork, so no hate mail. But yeah, I mean, and speaking in absolutes, right?
Yeah.
Like very commonly when we're angry or upset, it becomes always and never and all of that. You always do this. You never do this, right? Well, very few things are always and never, and nothing's perfect.
Yeah, and it eliminates the option for change.
Yeah,
And it moves into, there's that other cognitive distortion of minimizing the positive.
yeah,
You can easily get into a space of not seeing when someone is trying or putting out efforts.
yeah. Well, negative sentiment override, right? So like, it takes, what is it? Is it 4 to 1 or
5 to 1.
5 to 1? So 5 positive interactions to erase one negative interaction. I mean, that's a lot, right? And then if you dig yourself in a deep enough hole, right? Well, then you have the negative sentiment override that all you see is the negative stuff,
Right.
right? Because it's which we're kind of inclined to do.
Yeah, and you're training your mind, right? Like it's a mindset, and
Hmm.
you're training your brain and what to tune into. And our brain is already hardwired to protect us,
Yeah,
avoid danger, avoid insecurity,
yeah,
right? Physically and emotionally.
yeah,
And so that's just going to be natural for your brain to look at the negative or the risk. And it becomes this mindset that you feed into. And that's where you kind of see more of this is why I'm a pretty big proponent of the focusing on spirituality, because it starts to expand out what you're focusing on.
yeah,
You're not just focusing on short term, what's happening right now, right? Spirituality kind of starts to blend out into a much longer timeline. You're also not looking at the issues that are happening in front of you, right? You're trying to think, what does this do in the grand scheme of my life?
yeah.
Kind of thinking. So there's just higher level thinking that it starts to pull into.
Well, explain spirituality, because I think people are going to make the assumption that, okay, well now you're a Christian,
Right.
right? And so if somebody's going to work with you on spirituality, what they're going to get hammered over the head with is a Bible and
Right.
be forced, into Christianity,
Right.
right? And I've appreciated hearing what you have, researched and what you've learned about this. So maybe talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to focus on psychologically supportive spirituality, and there's more research coming out around how bringing awareness to an immaterial force or being can bring a sense of wholeness and connectedness. So it isn't trying to specify one religion or spiritual ideology over another. Instead, it's the recognition that the personal journey of identifying some of that awareness and some of that relationship between ourselves and our experiences and an immaterial force or being, just engaging in that can really be a supportive component to mental wellness and mental health in general. And there's more and more research coming out about things like the difference between different types of prayer, secular meditation versus spiritual meditation. And in that journal article specifically, they were highlighting the difference between using I focused statements
Mm.
such as I am strong, I am willing, I am loved.
Yeah.
That's considered secular meditation. But spiritual meditation was something like, God or higher power, whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
People call it different things, creator, the divine. But this higher power, loves me and therefore I can love others. Or this higher power is providing me strength even though I'm feeling weak. There's this focus on this immaterial force or being.
So, do they go into speculations in regards to why that's beneficial versus the I?
They were identifying this recognition that there's this lift of burden off of one personally,
That makes sense.
right? That instead of us carrying the weight to be strong
Yeah.
or to be love, it's coming from an outside source that's beyond us.
Well, AA has, I think, tapped in on that for
Big time.
decades, right? Is like part of, and I'm sober, but I'm not. I've never went through AA. The belief of something greater than yourself was important to be able to remain sober, right? That was something that they hit on, because I think AA was originally, I think, Christian based, I think.
I think so.
But as they started spanning out and helping more
Yeah.
people, right? They have kept that component of it. I
Right.
thought that was pretty important.
Well, but yeah, disassociating was something that I definitely have a past of. And what's interesting is that, I got heavily into yogic philosophy and meditation,
Mm-hmm.
and there is a component of disassociating with that.
Sure.
There was a huge level of healing that came from the practice of indifference.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there was this fine line, of getting to an emotionally neutral space
Mm-hmm.
to observe things through a non-emotional lens and then disassociating from it. There was kind of this balance and ebb and flow that happened between those things.
Yeah.
And there's been a couple articles I've come across that talk about like the dangers of meditation, and that is one of them. So you have to recognize like what's your mentality behind it, right? If you're like meditating in a vein of avoidance
Mm-hmm.
versus I'm going to meditate to become mindful and step back and witness my emotions at play, right? There's a little bit of a different mindset in that process.
I think that's where discernment, right, and consciousness comes in, because I think too much of anything can be a bad thing, right? Like some of these things that we develop as coping skills, right? Like if they become way too excessive, right, they can easily become maladaptive coping skills.
Yeah. Well, and there's that ebb and flow of relationships again.
Yeah.
If you have that feedback externally, right? And you have something you can almost calibrate yourself to, or at least use as a soundboard,
Yeah.
then it gets a little bit easier to self-reflect. Otherwise, you're just in them.
Hmm.
You're just in the tendencies. It's just like a part of who you are and what you do. And our brain wants consistency, predictability, and so it's easier to click into that mentality of like, this is just what I do in this situation,
Hmm.
you know, versus maybe grow into a more secure relationship and there's now, like you're saying, maladaptive. There's now these negative repercussions to something that once was a solution
Yeah.
to coping.
Well, it's interesting. So, I've been a therapist now as of yesterday or the day before for 12
Yeah,
years.
2 days ago.
2 days ago for 12 years. And, you know, I've really got to see the growth of some people. And, I've noticed this interesting pattern that like people come to me, they do individual work, right? And then they develop these coping skills and things that are helpful for them individually. And then now, you know, years later, they're in a relationship, and then all of a sudden, and I'm not saying this in a bad way, but they're coming back, and they're like, I either what we were doing before isn't working now, or my partner's struggling with my coping skills, or whatever it is, right? So then now it's like expanding, their network of things that they've learned, because what worked for them individually isn't working necessarily in the relationship, right? And for me, the way that I've thought about it is, right, like they learned how to speak a language to individually help themselves. Well, now, you know that you're bringing somebody else into this, right? Like there's a different tool set that you have to expand on, and it's what healthy relationships are and what they're made of, right? Like, very commonly people say, well, I want a relationship, I want a relationship, I want a relationship. And then they get in a relationship, and then 3 or 4 months later, and they're like, well, this is unhealthy and I'm not happy and all these things. And it's like, well, you didn't define what it was that you wanted, right? You just said you wanted a relationship, so you hopped into one, right? Like if you want a healthy relationship, there's different guidelines to that, right? And there's a lot more that it takes to get to a healthy relationship. And so you have to know what it is that you're looking for.
Yep, and that's exactly right. Like you have to know what you're looking for and then not settle.
Yeah.
I mean, relationships are so interesting because it's a natural part of who we are.
Hmm.
We crave connection, and connection nourishes us in so many ways. And then, being close to someone can also be like the demise of your mental wellness.
Sure.
And so,
Well, why? Why would it affect us in such a dramatic way, right? And I think about, when they talk about two people becoming one, the reality of that, right, is that your autonomic nervous system sync with the other person when you're living with them,
yeah,
right? And so, like, being disconnected from your partner is physiologically painful, right? Because of what's happening internally, right? Like your heart, becomes dysregulated, your breathing becomes dysregulated because that person that you were once synced with, now you're disconnected, right? And I think
right.
that's why people scramble, right, to fix things, right, and just try to like figure out how to get some type of resolve, right?
Well, and why do you feel people would rush into relationships and compromise their standards or ideals?
Fear of being alone, right? Like we're not designed to be alone, right? Like the worst punishment you can give somebody is isolation, right? I mean that's why in incarceration, right? Like they put people in solitary confinement because of what it does to them, unfortunately, psychologically, right? So then now people feel so disconnected, right? And then somebody gives them attention, right? And it's like, oh, okay, well, let me jump on this, right? Because it gives me that feel good feeling, right? And
Right.
feel good feeling, right? You start producing serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin, right? And we know how addictive oxycontin is, right?
Yeah.
And so now you're producing this naturally. So what people constitute as love, right? Like, they just jump into it. And then all of a sudden the reality hits them when they're no longer producing as much oxytocin, and it's like, oh wait, you know, I'm not getting all my needs met with this relationship, or you're not perfect, right? Like you have faults,
Yeah.
and then things start to fall apart.
Well, and that's why I try to encourage people who I've talked to who are single or looking for a relationship or trying to find some sort of resolve in their relationship. It's like you will learn far more about someone when things aren't going
Yeah,
well or when there's a challenge in comparison to what they tell you or what they convey when everything is flowing smoothly.
mm,
How someone responds and adapts in a challenge is everything.
sure.
I mean, that for me was the biggest draw to you, was when there was in the beginning of our relationship, challenging discussions or I was feeling a lot of insecurity. You were very receptive and like supportive. Um, and that was like refreshing compared to the relationships that I had come out of in the past. And,
Mm,
I think that that's been a big thing with our relationship. We've really valued maintaining some sense of receptivity.
mm,
Even if it's, even if we have challenging discussions or we're not seeing eye to eye at points, we have gone to a place where it's like, okay, if we need to take a break, we can take a break. And, by the end of the conversation or later in the conversation, there is more receptivity, more hearing the other person out, and more, you know, desire to connect,
yeah.
and turn towards rather than turn away from.
Well, then I think also, right, like the commitment, right? We're both committed to the relationship. Yeah, the idea of
Mm-hmm.
divorce isn't. It's not necessarily on the table, right? And
Yeah.
and it's not because it's like, well, you're never gonna leave me type thing, right?
Right.
It's that we've made that commitment, and so the idea of something greater being out there, like I realize that it's just fantasy, and there's no there's no point, right? Like I've I've been out there. I know what the fishing looks like.
Well, and it turns like for me, I had big commitment issues.
Yeah.
And then, I remember like I was never a girl that dreamed of marriage or fantasized about a wedding or anything like that.
Mm.
And, once we were engaged and the wedding was approaching, I was like, whoa, like I'm going to be a wife, and it was this very surreal feeling, but there was for me a lot of peace that started to come from that,
Mm.
because our relationship was in a better place and it was also this like this person is going to work through this with me,
Mm.
right? I don't have to be afraid of, abandonment or me doing something wrong and that person leaving me,
Yeah.
and I think that that's been a huge security. It's also something we've witnessed in our, challenging discussions or arguments where it's like, okay, the end goal, we're going to have to work through this.
Yeah.
Like, we actually have to come up with a resolution
Yep.
in this.
Yeah.
It's not like there's really another alternative.
Well, I think in the beginning also, like it was easy for me to threaten the relationship, like, oh, that's it. I'm mad. I'm upset. I'm
Same.
out of here, right? Type thing, right? And it wasn't that I wanted to leave the relationship. Part of it was I wanted you to chase after me, right? I wanted you to be like, no, no, no. I need you so much. You can't leave, right? And then I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I feel better about myself, right? And I can stick this thing out. And I recognize how I fed into that in a negative way, right? That's that reactive attachment, like understanding the attachment styles and how I presented in them, allowed me to be able to like recognize when I did the maladaptive tools or skills that come with these things, right? And how to do something different, right? And it was staying in the relationship with you, right? And recognizing like that you're a safe person, that you're somebody that does have my best interest at heart. And so, we have moved towards security, right, in our relationship, but it came by establishing that emotional safety and trust, right? That knowing, like, yeah, you're not here to try to intentionally hurt me,
Right.
right? Like stuff comes up, right? But the goal is always to try to like resolve or talk about it or get back to where we were at one point.
Right. Man.
So
Yeah. No, I think that's a big contributor.
it seems like there's a lot going on in this podcast.
I know. For people who are just listening, we have a shader that's whipping Sean in the face.
Yeah. And
This is the challenge with being outside.
yeah.
Like, I love doing the podcasts outside because you're in an open space. It's far more peaceful, but it's got external variables that we can't control as well.
Yeah. Chickens screaming, geese flying over,
Wind
wind
blowing.
blowing things down, but I'm sure there's some type of relevant lesson in this. Life is messy and problems are going to happen. How are you going to handle it? How are you going to deal with it?
Yeah.
Your attitude is everything.
We'll still be vulnerable through it.
Yeah. Yeah, stepping into that. So,
Yeah.
well, I mean, there's a lot of things I appreciate, you know, and some of the big things that I appreciate about you is, your willingness to be vulnerable and also hold yourself accountable to things. Like being able to say, I recognize, yeah, I didn't handle that thing right, or I could have done this differently. It allows me to be able to soften and recognize, like, okay, like, you know, I made a mistake or I didn't handle this situation right. I don't have to double down on it, and just try to fight to prove my point, right? Like I feel heard a lot in our relationship, and if I don't, we're able to bring it up or talk about it in different ways. So,
Yeah. I appreciate that about our relationship too. It's got that. That's been an improvement
yeah.
on, in general. It's
Well,
like feeling that receptivity and feeling more heard and
if there's something that I want people to take away from, this podcast and podcasts in the future is to recognize that, change is possible, right? You have opportunities to learn, these different skills and things. And if you feel like you're really struggling, you're not happy with your relationship or you're not happy with your life or whatever, right? Like seek out other people, that have the skills to help you expand on that. I think that's a lot of things that people don't want to do, right? And as we were talking about the importance of the relationship with the clinician, find somebody that you're comfortable with,
mm,
right? Find somebody that like you resonate with, like, you know, don't just see a counselor just to see a counselor or check the
yeah,
box, right? Like, shop around. If you meet with somebody a few times and you're just not vibing with them, like don't give up. Don't make the assumption that all counselors are the same and, they just tell you what you want to hear, that kind of stuff. I mean, some of them are, right? I mean, like every profession, there's good ones and there's bad ones. But, keep trying until you find one that you resonate with.
yeah. Yeah, well, it's funny. Your line is change is possible,
Hmm.
and when I reflect on life, for me, it's like change is inevitable.
Hmm.
You're either prepared for it or you're not.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of interesting to reflect on that in many ways because I feel like those are two different audiences, right? Change is possible is speaking to people that are like, yeah, I really want to make this change, or something isn't right, and I want to step forward into something new, and and a lot of what I have experienced, it was like I didn't want change. Change is fearful. Change
Yeah.
is scary. And for me in my life, it's been like you can't stop change.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately an
Well,
inevitable component to life, and you're either prepared and equipped and able to adapt, or you're not.
yeah.
And that's really that's what will make or break you in
Yeah.
certain situations. At least that's what I experienced.
It goes back to the river, right? Like
Yeah,
you're not going to stop the river,
yeah,
right? Like you just have to learn to how to be able to go with it, right? And yeah, I mean, change no matter what is inevitable,
yeah,
right? That's why, it's hard to hear people say, "Well, it's just the way I am," right?
yes,
You just take me the way I am and don't try to change me, right? Like that's a very rigid perspective to have with things,
right,
right? And I think about why would somebody develop that type of perception, right? And it's they don't trust,
right.
right? Something obviously has happened that made them not want to trust the world around them,
Or the
right?
feedback they're getting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, but yeah, I mean, change is inevitable.
yeah, and having that support system that you can be receptive to is key,
Yeah.
super key.
Yeah, I agree.
Mm. How to get there? We'll talk about it in another podcast.
Tune,
I already have to split this into two. This is definitely going to be a part one and part two.
tune into the next episode.
Yeah. Hopefully it'll be more about psychology tips instead of a series of unfortunate events.
Yeah, it'll probably be both. Hopefully, we won't be fighting curtains and whatnot.
Yeah. That's easier to manage compared to a lot of other things
Sure.
in life.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
So, well, we'll track the progress and things that are going on.
yeah. We will. We'll share. Keep people updated.
Yeah. Love you.
Love you. Appreciate you.